All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Carpenter. I'm a third-year PhD candidate here at YSE and a member of the BIOMES committee. This semester, BIOMES partnered with PE2, People, Equity, and the Environment, to bring you a seminar series centering environmental justice and focusing on topics that pair with our environmental justice curriculum here at YSE. Today, we are very excited to host Karenna Gore, the founder and executive director of the Center for Earth Ethics. Some housekeeping items. We are accepting suggestions for this fall semester seminar and for community conversations this semester. If you're interested in partnering with BIOMES as a SIG, learning community, or as a student or faculty, just scan the QR code here and fill out the form, or you can email biomes.yse@yale.edu directly. It's a great way to showcase a speaker relevant to your interests to the larger YSE community. After the talk, there'll be a short Q&A following. If you're attending on Zoom, just submit your questions to the Q&A box at any time or use the raise hand function at the end of the talk and we'll get you speaking privileges. And if you're in person, just save your questions for the end and we have runners for mics. So thank you, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Mary Evelyn Tucker, who directs the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale and is a joint lecturer and researcher at YSE and the Div School. Mary Evelyn and the Forum are our partners today, and she will be introducing Karenna. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And so nice to see you, Karenna. Wonderful. Glad the technology is working. So just quickly, so we can get to her talk. Karenna Gore is the founder and executive director of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and an ex officio member of the faculty of the Earth Institute at Columbia. The Center for Earth Ethics bridges the worlds of religion, academia, policy, and culture to discern and pursue the changes that are necessary to stop ecological destruction and create a society that values the long-term health of the whole community of life. A graduate of Harvard College, Columbia Law School, and Union Theological Seminary, Karenna has also worked as a lawyer and a writer and is the author of Lighting the Way, 9 Women Who Changed Modern America. She lives in New York City with her 3 children, and I'm delighted to welcome her as a friend for many, many years. She's doing wonderful work, and I know you'll enjoy her and interact with her and your questions as well. Thanks, Karenna. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I want to express my respect and gratitude for the Yale School of the Environment, which has a significant legacy and a hard-earned place on the cutting edge of this work, and also to Dr. Mary Evelyn Tucker, who is a true pioneer and preeminent scholar of the field of religion and ecology and has been a great source of guidance and inspiration to me personally. Someone said I'm muted. Am I muted or you can hear me? Can you all hear me? Okay. So the role, did you hear what I just said? I want to acknowledge Dr. Tucker as well as Yale School of the Environment. Mary Evelyn Tucker has been a great inspiration and guide to me personally. So it's very meaningful to me that she is here. And I wish I was with you all in person. I hope that I can have a rain check on that. The role of religion in the relationship between humans and our environment is a very big topic, partly because religion, of course, encompasses and intersects with so many other fields. Those who study religion closely can usually detect where the thought forms and behavioral patterns of the secular world are informed by belief systems, for better or for worse. We can also draw from the world's faith and wisdom traditions to distill values that are held in common, but are nevertheless out of step with the laws, policies, and discourse that currently drive our society. I will be talking along those lines today. I will be asserting that our ecological crisis is driven by a flawed value system, which is bolstered by a faulty perception of who we are. and showing how 3 current movements can help us correct that. But I also want to mention up front that the study of religion proper deserves a great deal more respect and attention than it sometimes receives in environmental studies. The vast majority of people in the world, an estimated 80%, identifies with some religious tradition. Many people experience their sense of meaning, belonging, and moral obligation across and through these traditions. And there really is no better resource than the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology for the study of how these traditions relate to the environment. Religious institutions also own land, run schools, administer social services, and are entwined with local cultures in deep and myriad ways. The Faith for Earth initiative at the United Nations Environment Program is one umbrella under which people are exploring how this major force field can be used to stem what they describe as a planetary crisis. Organizations like Green Faith, Interfaith Power and Light, and others play important roles. And there are many denominational and faith-based, specific faith-based environmental organizations that have sprung up in recent years. The Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary, where I work, does some of that kind of work. We have an annual ministers training called Ministry in the Time of Climate Crisis that brings together faith leaders to explore the moral and spiritual dimensions of climate. We do this through learning not only about science and policy, but also sacred texts and teachings, ritual and ceremony, ethical discernment, and how to navigate highly politicized community conversations. We have come to see 3 main roles for faith communities in the climate crisis: prophetic, pastoral, and practical. Prophetic is telling the truth. In the tradition of the prophets, this means speaking from a place much deeper than what is popular or even politically expedient and feasible. In this time when truth is especially contested, it is all the more essential. Pastoral is guiding and counseling people through experiences and feelings, including trauma, grief, anxiety, and fear, which so often block people from even thinking about the ecological crisis we are facing. And although many of those emotional aspects and psychological aspects have been seen as the domain of psychotherapy and pharmacology, even those fields are being upended by the magnitude and implications of the ecological challenge. Practical refers to the greening of buildings, issues of divestment, and for many congregations, place-based community outreach and organizing. Remember that many movements for political change in our history have found their tipping points where faith leaders helped to resolve causes into clearly understandable questions of right and wrong. And faith leaders have often helped guide people towards the real touch points for action. We know the most famous examples: Mahatma Gandhi in throwing off colonial rule in India, Bishop Desmond Tutu in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and of course, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement in the United States. These examples are inspirational, but in our time, we are becoming more and more aware that behind the great individual leaders in history, there have always been movements full of people that never become famous. It is movements that are necessary to win values-based struggles. And the most resonant refrains these days reflect that wisdom. We are the ones we have been waiting for, and there is no more time to wait. As all the International Panel on Climate Change reports warn, and the next one is due on February 28th, quite soon, and as we can see for ourselves with the stronger and more frequent storms, floods, heat waves, wildfires, drought, ice melt, and sea level rise, the climate crisis is urgent and perilous. Nowadays, there's a wave of voices that want us to respond by focusing only on the level of effects, explaining how we can adapt, or claiming that new technologies will capture carbon emissions, or even allowing us to think about geoengineering the sky in order to accommodate all of this ongoing activity on the ground. This line of thinking is insanely risky and distracting. If we do not make fundamental changes at the level of cause, we will stay in this pattern and on this trajectory, with larger and larger swaths of our planet becoming uninhabitable for humans. So what is the cause? The great Gus Speth of Yale has described it by naming two modern megatrends: pollution and depletion. More than half of the global warming pollution that has been put in the atmosphere, that is in the atmosphere now, has been put there in the last 25 years, the time period during which we've known the most about this cause and effect, and have developed attractive and available alternatives that are not only affordable, they are often significantly cheaper than continuing to burn fossil fuels. Nonetheless, 49% of fossil fuel infrastructure has been built since just 2003, with oil and gas pipelines continuing to receive support of major financial institutions and powerful governments. And all the while, when it comes to depletion, the rate at which we're depleting critical carbon sinks like forests and wetlands has steadily increased. And so there is a deeper level of cause as well. This crisis is about more than data and science and technology, as important as they are. This crisis and our collective refusal to solve it is about perception and values. The current value system is based on short-term monetary gain. It is embedded in the measurement of gross domestic product, for example, the GDP, which is lifted up often when people herald economic growth or bemoan its loss. But famously, GDP does not count for things: pollution, depletion, inequality, or positive long-term effects of protecting commonly held sources of well-being. So note that 4 of the things that GDP does not count are the modern megatrends that Gus Speth identifies: pollution and depletion. The well-established field of beyond GDP work, which I'm sure many of you all are already familiar with, is very important, and it's particularly important to see how it is embedded still within prevailing development models. This value system is also at play when people point to the stock market or simplistic job reports as the indicators, not only indicators when they're talking about the relative fortunes of politicians, which we all know is a favorite topic that often displaces actual discernment of what is happening, but also it's lifted up as some indicator of the health of the whole. So we have to look at also the conversation in the business world. Of course, it's true that the business world may be making some slow progress in incorporating social and environmental factors into their thinking, but that trend is often more for show. It's often more performative than it is real. And in any case, it has been far outpaced by the trend in politics to argue that our government should be run more like a business. We have to look at this value system and how pervasive it has become in how we can govern ourselves and deal with this entire situation. Creating a counterforce to it is not as simple as just making a call to be moral. And that's in part because there are implicit moral claims propping up the current value system already. These are the ones that are lifted up to block the change that we need, and we have to interrogate them. The theologian Cynthia Mo-Lebeda has written extensively about a concept called structural evil, drawing on the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was executed by the Nazis in his native Germany when he went back to oppose them. She explains that one of the key characteristics of structural evil is that it easily masquerades as good. When the calls are made for conventional economic growth and development to outweigh environmental concerns, they are made with an implicit moral claim that this conventional economic growth will result in the most good. But we must ask, for whom? Some years ago, a friend of mine from the Church of Sweden was relaying wisdom from his bishop, and he said something that really stuck with me. He said, in any room where there are policy decisions being made about climate, there should be 3, or that will influence climate, there should be 3 empty chairs designated for those who are simultaneously the most impacted and the least likely to have a voice. one for the poor, one for future generations, and one for all non-human life. So the more I've thought about this, the more obvious it seems that this would not only be a matter of fairness, but also a matter of global security. It gives new meaning to what Dr. King meant when he said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, which also resonates with the teaching from the great recently passed Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. We are here to awaken to the illusion of our separateness. An ethics teacher once taught me that one of the first tasks of an ethicist is to be aware of how the circle of moral concern that you are working with has been drawn, which makes sense, of course. Workplace ethics draw a circle of moral concern in which people that you work with have an expectation of different behavior and thought than those outside of that circle. We have to think about the way we've drawn the circle of moral concern in this country when we talk about the economy. If we had drawn it differently to take into account those 3 empty chairs, we certainly would not be in this absurdly perilous situation. The good news is that widening this circle can be accomplished simply by drawing on the insights and actions of 3 movements that are already underway: the environmental justice movement, the youth climate movement, and the rights of nature movement. I'm not claiming that these movements are all similar or that each is without flaws or complications, or even that they perfectly fit those 3 empty chairs. But I do know it is worth learning from them, from the way they relate to each other and how they all fundamentally challenge us in exactly the ways we need to change our perception and values and correct our course. So let's take them one at a time. Environmental justice. I am not as comprehensive a scholar of the environmental justice movement as others you will have in this lecture series. I am speaking from my own experience as a frequent witness to this movement through the work I've been doing in the last 7 years at the intersection of climate and faith. The environmental justice movement in this country grew out of the civil rights movement and shed light on the fact that toxic sites are commonly located in marginalized communities, which in this country have been largely determined by race. Professor Robert Bullard of Texas Southern University has found that statistically, the one factor that most accurately correlates with the location of these toxic sites is the race of people living nearby. His seminal book, Dumping in Dixie: Race, Class, and Environmental Quality, was published in 1990. Within this movement, of course, there has been a critique of the mainstream environmental movement, the white in mainstream environmental movement, which I will revisit in a moment. But notably, in 1991, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was held, attended by over 650 delegates from every US state, as well as from other countries. And they produced 17 principles of environmental justice, which were circulated at the Rio Earth Summit the following year. All this work is very important, and it is rising to the fore in a new way now. The climate emergency has brought it into focus, and the powerful insights are being studied and consulted more widely. Part of this is that the same activity that is the main driver of climate change, the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, also causes co-pollution of particulates that cause terrible health problems and even kill an estimated 9 million people globally every year. Incidentally, more and more are pointing out that that is a large multiple of those who are killed by COVID, not to diminish COVID. And in fact, there's a lot of crossover from people who are more vulnerable to COVID infection and fatality from having been exposed to those pollutants, which is part of what we have been grappling with in these past couple of years. So as the victims of this co-pollution are primarily those live near the polluting sites, and they disproportionately suffer from health problems, including respiratory, cardiac conditions, and cancer. And of course, there's also the fact that the impacts of climate-related extreme weather events also fall disproportionately on historically marginalized communities. As Reverend Gerald Durley wrote, he's a pastor from Atlanta who did march himself with Dr. King. He wrote a piece that caught my eye in 2013, in which he said, climate change is a civil rights issue. We are seeing its impacts in our own communities in the form of record-breaking temperatures, floods, droughts, hurricanes, and the list goes on. When your child suffers from asthma and cannot go out and play, as is the case for many in Atlanta, it is a civil rights issue. When unprecedented weather disasters devastate the poorest neighborhoods in places like New Orleans, New Jersey, New York, it is a civil rights issue. And the leadership, end quote, when the leadership from these frontline communities has been a key dynamic in reshaping the contemporary climate movement. And when it comes to faith, the effect of bringing EJ to the foreground of climate has also meant an influx of another set of faith-based calls. It is the teachings of love your neighbor as yourself. It is the sharp prophetic calls from the Hebrew Bible, like Isaiah 10:1-3. Woe to those who make unjust calls, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of fair treatment and withhold justice from the oppressed. This has all brought environmental work into coalitions with anti-poverty and anti-racism work. In fact, where I work at Union Theological Seminary, we have also from the Kairos Center, the leadership of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, led by Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis and Reverend Dr. William Barber II. They added ecological devastation to the list of intersecting evils that campaign is addressing. And of course, we know in the past years, the resonance of I Can't Breathe from the murders of Eric Garner and George Floyd has moved the many to draw the connection from racial violence to ecological devastation as well. So about 8 years ago, I traveled to North Carolina with then director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program, Jackie Patterson, to speak with people who were inundated by toxic coal ash-filled air in their community. Many had lost relatives to the health impacts. And amazingly, some local public health institutions had not helped them to connect these cancer clusters and asthma rates to local industries, perhaps in part because the polluting sites were seen as providing jobs and other resources for the community. So the residents who were suffering were besieged by grief as well as pollution and told cancer runs in their family. Some of them spoke to us about the connection they were making between layers of ash on their windowsills and windshields and the health impacts that people were breathing this in. Sometimes these places are thought of and referred to as sacrifice zones. The locations of these facilities are commonly picked by an alliance between state government authorities responsible for promoting economic growth and corporate interests eager to maximize profits and minimize expenses. And so implicit bias is at work and imbalance of power is at work and built into that equation. And these communities are left to fight back alone. So often lifted up as a hallmark of the environmental justice movement is what happened in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. A Black community was designated to receive hazardous waste landfill full of toxic PCBs, and the community resisted with creative measures, including almost all of them laying down in the road to block the trucks from bringing in that toxic waste. It resulted in over 500 arrests. My colleague at Center for Earth Ethics, William Barber III's grandfather was there, and Will has explained that the resonance of this today includes looking at that critique of the mainstream environmental movement that is responsive to mainly to white communities. And he says this is an example of hot spotting, which is also an issue, by the way, when we're talking about carbon markets. If we're not careful, progress in the awareness in the larger in the environmental work around the fact that waste is hazardous results in it being quickly moved to those areas where it harms frontline communities. To pick another more recent example, in the case of the Byhalia oil pipeline in Memphis, this was just in the past year. It was cited to run through Black neighborhoods in Southwest Memphis, actually 97% Black neighborhoods. And a spokesperson from the pipeline's parent company, Plains All American, was actually quoted in reference to why it was cited that way by saying it was, quote, the path of least resistance. So in the end, the local community actually mounted fierce resistance, and the pipeline was canceled when the companies pulled their funding. This is an example of the growing force and power of the environmental justice movement. I first learned about it online from the presentations of a young man named Justin Pearson. And he relayed how many other toxic sites were already in this Southwest Memphis community, including a giant Valero oil refinery. And he also said in detail how many community members they had lost to health effects, including both of his grandmothers died in their 60s from cancer. So the same pattern that exists there exists in Cancer Alley in St. James Parish in Louisiana, where grassroots activists are fighting against another petrochemical facility. And it existed in Union Hill, Virginia, where a Black community just successfully several years ago fought off the placement of the compressor station on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And incidentally, in that particular movement, interfaith dialogue and coalition building played a key role. There was a community with 2 Black Baptist churches, and there was a community called Yogaville, and they worked together in ways that actually included sharing teachings, and in some cases Dharma and Karma, and other cases the Judeo-Christian biblical texts, some of which I've lifted up before, and they came together with ritual and ceremony. They came together in ways that bonded them in what they called a circle of protection. And it was palpable to see the strength that gave that movement against that compressor station, which ended up really playing a big role in taking down the entire Atlantic Coast Pipeline. So let me say, also, many indigenous peoples have contributed powerfully to the emergence of the environmental justice movement. And often indigenous communities have led the way. The premise is sometimes that comes out of this work that nature has a voice in these issues as well. For example, a letter sent to President Nixon from a group of Hopi elders in 1970 said in part, quote, "Today, the sacred lands where the Hopi live are being desecrated by men who seek coal and water from our soil, that they may create more power to the white man's cities. This must not be allowed to continue, for if it does, Mother Nature will react in such a way that all men will suffer the end of life as they now know it." This is an important connection to the rights of nature movement, which I will talk about last. The movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock was a watershed movement for the whole environmental justice movement, which brought environmental justice in a new way. The assertion, we are protectors, not protesters. The insight, water is life, and the charge to defend the sacred all added new layers of consciousness that continue to motivate many today. And by the way, just yesterday, the US Supreme Court decided a key issue in favor of those opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline, so it may finally be defeated. More recently, in the ongoing fight against another pipeline, Line 3 in Minnesota, Native American attorney and water protector Tara Huska emphasized in her testimonials that not only was this an environmental injustice against her First Nations people, but that all people must begin to think about where our water comes from, where our food comes from, where our energy comes from. And these native-led movements have been occasions for solidarity with peoples elsewhere, especially in the global South, where much of the extraction and pollution that fuels the global economy has been concentrated. There's great scholarship on this, including the book Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, where Rob Nixon quotes a leader of the Ogoni people in Nigeria, saying in response to the reaction to the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico, quote, "If this Gulf accident had happened in Nigeria, neither the government nor the company would have paid much attention. This kind of spill happens all the time here," is the quote. In the United States, I'm going to close my section on the environmental justice movement by saying this. It has gained considerable political power in the United States. This was apparent when an early frontrunner for the head of the Environmental Protection Agency was cast aside after a campaign led by EJ leaders And the post was given instead to North Carolina's secretary, who was the secretary of the State Department of Environmental Quality, Michael Regan, who had worked on mitigating the coal ash issue in North Carolina that I mentioned earlier. It's been evident in executive orders and the Justice 40 initiative coming out of the White House, and there's now a White House Environmental Justice Commission called WEJAC for short, and they just came out with a climate justice screening tool. Interestingly, a recent news story highlighted that there was some controversy about whether or not this environmental justice, climate justice screening tool should include race as a factor. In the end, it didn't. And this piece, I'm happy to send the links to all of these things to you all later. This piece quoted two opposing viewpoints. One was Robert Bullard, who felt that race should have been included. And another was actually my former colleague at Center for Earth Ethics, Catherine Flowers, who explained that race was one factor, but in environmental justice work, it's not the only factor, and that there are other elements of marginalization. Also mentioned that this, including it, might make that more likely to be struck down by the courts. And so this is one of many very important fronts to watch in the environmental justice movement. The youth climate movement. The youth climate movement has brought moral force and organizing energy to the task of forging a new ethic for the earth. It is powered by the theme of intergenerational justice, with young people speaking not only for themselves, but for those children who will be born in the future. So I want to acknowledge that there are other important manifestations of the voice for future generations, because many come from within faith and wisdom traditions. The Haudenosaunee, known as the Iroquois, and other native peoples hold the famous teaching of 7 generations, that every major decision made today should be made with in mind its effect on 7 generations ahead. Also, when the Pope, the Ecumenical Patriarch, and the Archbishop of Canterbury came together to issue a joint statement before the recent Glasgow Climate Conference, they led off by calling out this voice of future generations, saying we must decide what kind of world we want to leave to future generations. And they cited Deuteronomy 30:19. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. This idea of covenant, this call of the heavens and earth as witnesses, is very resonant in this time with actually all 3 of these movements we're discussing. The ethicist Stephen Gardner has called for a global constitutional convention focused on future generations, and says the climate crisis is best understood as, quote, a tyranny of the contemporary rather than tragedy of the commons. And there are other examples as well. But the global youth climate movement is giving voice in a more visceral way. In some cases, these activists are actually fairly young children, openly invoking those yet to come into the world. They tend to focus on the science and the timelines and the targets, with a not so gentle reminder that older generations who are now in power will not be alive nearly as long as they will be. And who will ever forget Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg saying, "How dare you?" on the main stage of the United Nations. But actually, there were youth climate activists, of course, before Greta, including Yale graduate Severin Cullis-Suzuki, who made a speech in 1992 at the UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and organizations like Earth Guardians by Xutezcat Martinez and Zero Hour with Jamie Margolin and others in the US. All of these were organized before Greta's Friday for Future movement started. But she broke through in an unprecedented way, in part because she matched her own behavior so totally to her call, not flying, keeping a vegan diet, refusing to buy new things. So she's unique in some ways, but there are many youth from all over the world speaking up. New groups, Earth Uprising, Rise Up, of course, the Sunrise Movement, and also multiple campus divestment campaigns that are heating up as we speak. All these are voices from the youth climate movement that speak for future generations. Youth are also plaintiffs in significant lawsuits that are important not only for the possible legal outcomes, but for the platform they provide to change the conversation. In 2015, a coalition called Our Children's Trust filed the Juliana versus United States lawsuit, claiming the US government had violated constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property by continuing to authorize, permit, and subsidize fossil fuels. The Ninth Circuit dismissed that case. But there are more. In Held versus State of Montana, which was filed in March 2020, 16 youth plaintiffs are alleging that their state government's reliance on fossil fuel development violates their state constitutional rights. Montana has a provision in its constitution, which was added in 1972. And I want to note that time, that year and around that year in 1972, many seeds were planted because of a wave of awareness. And the Montana provision says, quote, the state and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations. So in media surrounding this lawsuit, the plaintiffs have been quoted raising the issue of protecting future generations as key to their case. The trial date has been set for February 6, 2023. The youth climate movement is usually focused on the future impacts to the planet as a whole, but it also intersects with environmental justice, particularly through voices from the global south. This part of the movement, when it references actions across nations, as well as focuses on the impacts in addition to the source pollutants, is more often referred to as climate justice. In an online press conference on Thursday of last week, the opening day of the EU-Africa Summit in Brussels, youth climate justice activists from Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya, and Europe called for an end to pushing fossil fuel projects on the African continent, decrying the unfairness of ravaging their land to fuel a global economy from which they feel they do not benefit. They spoke against the East Africa crude oil pipeline project, which is actually supported by leaders such as French President Macron and major financial institutions. This gathering included a young woman, Vanessa Nakate, who's become very well known for her prophetic leadership. Also, the founder of Fridays for Future Uganda, Hilda Flavia Nakabuye, said in the press conference, quote, people are already displaced, their incomes and livelihoods affected, unacceptable risks to water resources, biodiversity, and natural habitats. At a time where climate catastrophes are worsening, unlocking a new source of carbon emissions is unacceptable. And she added, climate harm puts millions of lives at risk, at stake, and is a mockery for the existence of generations to come. The rights of nature movement. The rights of nature movement seeks legal standing for natural entities, such as rivers, lakes, and mountains, and even whole ecosystems, such as forests. The current dominant value system treats nature primarily as property, where resources can be found, devoid of rights and subject to destruction by whoever claims ownership. This is, of course, with the exception of certain environmental regulations, like in this country, the Endangered Species Act, which is why it becomes such a political battleground and why sometimes those conversations are so distorted and focused on things, whether it's the spotted owl or whatever it is, that aren't necessarily the full scope of what is at stake. The rights of nature movement aims to protect nature by pulling it into the category of rights-based claims that are recognized in legal systems. This movement grows out of indigenous cosmologies and values. There is here a very important religious history to be aware of, and I'm sure many of you already are, but can't help but mention this marriage of Christianity and colonization that denied indigenous peoples freedom of religion and sought to wipe out animistic sensibilities that regarded natural entities as having agency and spirit. There is a very well-known essay by Lynn White, published in 1967, called The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, which argues that the trajectory we were even on in 1967, even more so now, began with the victory of Christianity over paganism in medieval Europe. There's been considerable pushback from religious scholars against this thesis, but it resonates today for good reason. There's a long overdue and heightened awareness of more recent history of the interaction of institutional Christianity in its one manifestation, and Indigenous traditions, particularly in the United States and Canada. Religious scholarship, I mean, in terms of where I'm aware of this wave of awareness right now around the boarding schools, for example, recent scholarship has highlighted that the papal bulls, these decrees from the Vatican in the 15th century, invoked the Bible to launch European conquest of Africa and the Americas, resulting in the doctrine of discovery that has served to erase indigenous peoples' relationship to this land. And there has been a lot of grappling with the truth recently of these Christian boarding schools and other institutions committing horrible atrocities against Native peoples just within the past couple of generations, including punishing them for speaking their language, banning their ceremonies, seizing their sacred sites, and sometimes renaming them with names that reference the devil and more. Where the theology is concerned, the use of the concept of dominion from the book of Genesis, for example, or imago Dei, that human beings and only human beings are created in the image of God, from the book of Genesis, there has been so much work done. The work of Pope Francis in particular, I would highlight in Laudato Si and other writings, is hugely significant. There's a lot of painstaking attention paid to correcting misinterpretations of dominion, and also an assertion that Indigenous peoples should be primary dialogue partners when it comes to issues that affect their territories. But this painful history is very near the surface now, for good reason. The legal rights of nature movement also comes from other sources, and there are some roots and milestones to be aware of. In 1972, legal scholar Christopher Stone published a law review article entitled "Should Trees Have Standing? Towards Legal Rights for Natural Objects." And soon after, around the same time, William O. Douglas wrote a dissent in Sierra Club versus Morton along the same lines, arguing that, quote, "Contemporary public concern for protecting nature's ecological equilibrium should lead to conferral of standing," meaning you can get a place in court, "upon environmental objects to sue for their own preservation." The rights of nature movement also draws on the work of Thomas Berry, a great and important thinker that Mary Evelyn Tucker knew well and teaches about. One of his teachings that resonates with many people in this time is that the great work now is to realize that the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And he, coming out of the Catholic tradition, is of course acutely aware of that distortion of the idea of dominion that would see everything as an object and a resource. And as Mary Evelyn Tucker and her husband John Grimm have written, he also originated the term earth jurisprudence. And he's argued that the laws of the earth are primary, and we should actually write that into our systems of governments. So as I wrap up on rights of nature, I want to say, thankfully, there are some important examples where this is actually being done in practice. Legal personhood has been granted to the Wanganui River in New Zealand with reference to a treaty, and with guardianship designated to a representative of the Maori people and also of the Crown. In 2008, Ecuador adopted provisions in its constitution that acknowledge the rights of nature. And just a few months ago, these provisions resulted in a series of court decisions that actually upheld rights of nature. Most significantly, the controversial Los Cedros decision blocked a mining project because it would damage a forest richly populated with many species of life. In the US, there have been attempts, including with Lake Erie, the Colorado River, the waterways of Florida, all of which do run up against considerable barriers, but it's an ongoing movement. And there are many more examples. And for those who want to explore this movement, I recommend that you go to the website of a United Nations program called Harmony with Nature that has many resources available. The rights of nature movement connects to both the EJ movement and the youth climate movement. The very first principle of environmental justice in that first People of Color Leadership Summit in 1991 is environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. The dialogue between the rights of nature and environmental justice movements is one of the most interesting fronts to watch, because there are those who do raise concerns that recognizing non-human rights would threaten to detract from those whose human rights are still not being fully honored. But many point out that in actuality, there is much more overlap. Rights of nature proponents point out that it is not wealthy, privileged people who rely on, say, swimming in a river to cool off on a hot day, or gathering food in a healthy forest for a meal. Those are the common areas that we have been allowing to be devoured by this value system, driven to make products and create markets for the global economy, that instead we could protect if we widen the circle of moral concern. And there are other examples I would love to cite, but I want to keep on time. Related to the rights of nature movement is another ecocentric legal initiative to make ecocide a crime under the Rome Statute, which governs the jurisdictions of the International Criminal Court. And this is a very interesting, exciting movement, which there's been a legal definition of ecocide launched, and we will see whether or not that process actually gets traction. Beneath these ecocentric legal efforts, there is a shift in consciousness in how we think about nature. I'm reminded of an essay that came out on the first day of the Religions for the Earth conference that launched the Center for Earth Ethics. It was published in the journal Science in 2014, and it was co-authored by an economist and a climate scientist. But what they expressed was the need for religious leaders to step up to address the climate crisis. And the reason is, they said, quote, "Over and above institutional reforms and policy changes that are required, there is a need to reorient our attitude toward nature and thereby towards ourselves." So to conclude, we live in a time of consequences and opportunities. We are burdened with a flawed value system, but we have the opportunity to change it. One way we can change it is by insisting on a different perception of who is a valid stakeholder in the economy, and by consciously widening the circle of moral concern. As many are well aware, the words economy and ecology come from that same root word oikos, meaning household. The concepts signified by these words also come from the same root human experience, where and how we live our lives. The three movements I have described here can help us widen our circle of moral concern to relate to one another and to nature, as if we are all part of the same global family. And when it comes to the climate emergency, we must widen the circle in a different sense too, or perhaps I should say, widen the sphere to include the layers underneath the land and the ocean, and to include the atmosphere above. All of this is part of our home. These are not merely there for depletion and pollution. They are part of the whole community of life. So let the circle be widened and let the sphere be unbroken. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karenna. Do we have a few questions, comments, responses? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate you bringing in texts and sources from the Hebrew Bible. I am Jewish and feel that my Jewish faith very much informs my environmentalism. I think something that I grapple with is that there are these very inspiring texts within, our religious texts, and there are portions of those texts that are very horrifying. Like within that section of Deuteronomy, God also commands us to go into the land of Israel and kill all of the native people who are living there. And so I'm wondering, how do we grapple with these portions of texts that, really tell us to care for the environment, but also tell us to do some really horrible social things?
Such a great question. I actually read Deuteronomy closely recently before a Bible study with the Poor People's Campaign with Liz Theo-Harris and others, and I was thinking about that as well. And one thing that I would say that she pointed out is that the context is a people being led out of slavery, that there is a very different energy and call to that type of covenant making and those kinds of instructions in that specific situation that is well understood, and that the covenant itself has so much good in it that we must grapple with it and grapple with those parts, but also be able to see its power. And of course, I tend to defer to Jewish scholars on issues in the Hebrew Bible. And I believe there's a great deal of important work being done that you could look. Dayenu is and Hazon. These are Jewish environmental and climate groups that are doing those scriptural studies as well. And so I'm thankful that work's being done. I think it's crucially important.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk today. One thing that comes to mind for me that really caught my interest was the mention of writing like natural laws into our jurisprudence. And I'm wondering if you have suggestions of or examples of ways that has happened well.
Yes, so there's well, in Ecuador is one, because, and I mean, I'm not sure if your question is US specific, but there's a lot more work to be done in the United States on this. There's work being done in tribal communities and jurisprudence. In fact, with the Line 3 pipeline, actually, the White Earth Band of Ojibwe has written into their tribal laws a right of wild rice as their sacred food and plant. And they use that to actually challenge the Line 3 pipeline. That's not exactly the same thing as the laws of nature that you're talking about. It's more about biocultural heritage, but it is explaining that you can't, there are things that are affected. You can't talk about putting a pipeline through an ecosystem without understanding the ecological relationships that are going to be affected and moved around and how human beings are connected to them. In Ecuador, in the Constitution, there's more of a sense where the laws of nature themselves are currently carrying weight. And I would say that that's particularly because where it has been upheld, in these recent cases, I'm told by Hugo Echeverria, who's one of the lawyers working down there I was talking to recently, says the courts and the judges like the science. They're looking at a provision that is upholding rights of Pachamama, and based in part on the indigenous concept sumak kausai, or well-being from the Quechua, but they totally understand that it's the science that is showing how this well-being is being disrupted. And so the precautionary principle of, listen, we think this mining project is going to disrupt the well-being of this project, so we're actually going to stop it, is an example of where the natural laws are being abided, rather than thinking that this all happens in some abstract sense that has to do more with people's sort of data gathering than it does with the actual living interconnectedness of the ecosystem.
Thank you. I'm going to just very quickly go through these slides about the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology that's been based here since Gus Speth invited us 16 years ago. But first, let's have another round of applause for Karenna. So Gus Speth said we have science and policy, but we need religion and values, as Karenna has just said. So I just wanted to share with you, is it going forward? This? Okay. Okay, so that's the website. This is a gargantuan website and has things from all the world's religions. Let's go forward. This was from the Harvard conferences that did 10 conferences, 10 books on the world religions in the mid-90s. So just keep going through. This is illustrates on our website of the Western religions, the Asian religions, and indigenous religions, which is John's specialty, John Grimm, my husband, who works with me on this, and interreligious issues. If you give me the thing back, I can probably do it. So on this website, we have overview essays introducing you to the religion and their ecological implications. We've got scriptures to the question here, how do we retrieve, reevaluate scriptures, and so on. And we have engaged projects. So eco-justice, there's a huge hub on eco-justice. You can follow up with that. Okay. I guess I need you again. The right side of the keyboard. Why don't you just keep doing it for me? Sorry. So this is the one thing I just wanted to leave you with. We've just launched in January MOOCs, massive open online classes, 6 MOOCs on religion. It's called Religions and Ecology, Restoring the Earth Community. Okay. And these courses are hosted by Yale and Coursera online. They include introductions, an indigenous course, one on South Asian religions and ecology, East Asian, one on the Western religions, and one on Christianity. People can take them as a specialization or individually. So that's the online URL for it. Okay, keep going, just keep hitting them. They have lectures and interviews. They have readings and videos. They have questions and interactive responses. Students are helping to do that. Just keep going quickly. So the themes are biodiversity, climate change, food systems, diversity of voices, eco-justice. This is a book that's being used for it that's also online. We're working with the UN Sustainable Development Goals to highlight, and we'll just keep going really quickly through these. Okay, the indigenous one has interviews from people all over the planet. Every continent is represented. South Asian shows Buddhists ordaining trees. So we've got Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism. East Asia, we've got Confucianism, Taoism, and Shinto and shamanism, and the Western religions, as we know. So I'm going to just, Christianity is its own standalone course because there's 2 billion Christians. And she mentioned the Pope, the Greek Orthodox, and so on. So these are free for audit, accessible to a general audience. People can start at their own time, and they can engage with community mentors. So that's a follow through for anybody who wants to do these, maybe over the summer or whatever. But again, I don't know if Karenna is still here. Thank you so much to Karenna and for all the work that she's doing. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Karenna.
Thank you. Whoever asked the question about Deuteronomy, I just want to encourage you to pursue that, because I really think that it's an important one. And I'm so happy that you scholars are there doing that work. It's absolutely essential. And I enjoyed that so much. And thank you, Mary Evelyn, and thank you, Yale. Hope to come in person.
Thank you.